I found that the sort of things that didn't make sense in religious writing and experience were the ones that really appealed to me. And I couldn't work out why that was. And then at the same time, I was finding the same thing in design, that the pieces of work that really resonated with me were the ones that seemed to not make sense on some level, seemed to contradict themselves. If something's or seemingly contradictory or paradox, well, it gets your attention, and so you'll look at it. If it doesn't, if it seems to not resolve itself, that will get your attention. If you can get to that point where you've found the paradox, you've actually got the point of where something is meaningful and valuable. When you find out how the opposites relate, it's kind of like a small little moment of enlightenment, and it's just an inherently pleasurable experience of that being a little bit more alive. You've got something, you've got simplicity and complexity working together always. All the energy and all the life is at the extremes. The extremes actually sort of cross-fertilize each other and lift each other up into something else. Freedom seems to be something that's kind of more real than the physical world, in the sense that you might say love is more real than physical objects. It's most alive, it's most real, it's most valuable. You can expand what it means to be a human being. I do think polarities are real, as in, I do think they're a part of life, the universe, and everything. We want to have as much polarization as possible, because if you have genuine polarization, you partake of both values of either end of the spectrum. And what keeps them healthy is that they have that underlying unity. There is a good way of being polarized. There is a good way of being extreme. It's just not the way that we've come to think about it. One definition of beauty is unity and diversity. So how do you see that two things that are opposed can both be true? How do you make all the things on the table cohere as a whole and yet all have their own individuality?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Love and Philosophy. This is a research podcast where we delve into all sorts of ideas and subjects relative to waymaking and navigability research and discuss life and learning through the lens of what we love. We share all the many ways there are to navigate the challenges and inspirations that we encounter each day. And we try to do this beyond the traditional divisions of what is supposed to fit together or not fit together, or what should or should not be discussed. And sometimes people reach out to me and want to talk about certain subjects that have been on the show, or they want me to work with them on certain projects and so on. But in this case, Alastair reached out, and who is the person I talked to today, and he wanted to talk about dichotomy and paradox and polarity because he's working on it in his work. And so I just want to share this conversation with you. It's not like an interview, really. It's more just a conversation of two people who care about a particular subject and are trying to understand how each other sees that subject. So in that spirit, today we have this controversial idea about polarity being a good thing. Now, that doesn't strike me in a positive way. To say polarity is good when we live in a world where everything is so polarized. And that's the kind of language we use to talk about these difficult challenges where people seem just to embody irreconcilable differences. But that's kind of the point, that it doesn't strike me in a positive way. There's some discomfort there that opens up a possibility to learn something. And what we might learn is that polarity within itself might not be the bad thing. So this conversation is a bit about that we seem to think of polarity as meaning opposition or dichotomy, and actually there's another way of thinking about it, which is just to think of it as 2 or 3 or 4. It doesn't even have to be 2, but just different positions which are far away relative to where you stand. So from your position, from wherever you are right now, for example, in your sensual, wonderful embodiedness, and I mean that in a physical way, but also, of course, in your mental and emotional landscape, your relational landscape. We can measure poles from there, or you can. Probably you're the only one who can. But, for example, you could sort of look physically. What's the farthest side of the world from where you are right now in 2 different directions or 4 different directions? And those would be poles, right? They would be sort of the farthest point. And 2 of those could be said to be the farthest from one another relative to where you're standing right now. And we can also do that in emotional and mental landscapes, because we could measure where we are right now relative to the parameters of our individual emotional and mental experiences over time. Each of us over our lifetime have had different emotional, mental, relational, physical experiences, and we can all think of extremes of those and maybe where we are right now relative to that. So it can be useful, but it's only useful, at least as far as I see it, if we are really careful and we understand when we're doing that, we're only doing a kind of measurement. Like when I'm looking at my life that way, I'm just trying to understand it. I'm not actually able to kind of take in all of my life and all of the amazing, expansive, complicated stuff, like just by using these kind of polls. However, it can be helpful, and it could also be helpful if I want to try to connect with someone and understand what they've been going through. Of course, I can't take my life and map it onto theirs because we've all had really different paths, but maybe I can try to share certain polarities that I experience and see how those fit with theirs. Something like that, taking in the expansiveness, realizing the real self of me and anyone else, you, anyone that we come into contact can never be measured in this way, at least not measured fully. Of course, we take these little measurements, but that doesn't mean we've measured a life. So it's a big difference between taking measurements to try to understand ourselves and one another versus thinking we've got the measurement or a measurement of an entire life. And also that, like, I can't assume everyone else has had the same kind of extremes and polarities when I'm discussing all of this with them, which I think is really hard not to do, not to just assume everyone we're talking to has had a kind of similar experience as us. But instead we could think of those as bridges or ways to maybe understand another person's life and see where their paths and polarities are different from ours or what we share in common. And that could be a really enriching process if it's done with care and realization and understanding that it's a thought experiment, which is also a bodily experiment, of course. But in any case, it's not the same thing as dichotomy. Dichotomy is a word that literally means to cut in half, to cut something into two parts, to sever it. It's a violence in a way. It's separating two parts of a whole, which we could argue about whether that's even possible, but of course, it's understandable as possible. You could cut something in half, literally. In this conversation, I think we talk about trying to cut a magnet in half, so you sort of lose the magnet. But in any case, to notice polarity is to hold the paradox, not to cut something in half. It's not to take two things out of one. Instead, it's to kind of hold those together and what seem like opposites, let them be, and kind of fill the wholeness, so to speak. So there's a lot more to say about that, and if you want to discuss that with me, I welcome you to join the Substack, which you can join for free. It's called Way in Life World. It's in the show notes. There's two Substacks. One is just for this channel if you want to listen to the audio, and then there's the Way in Life World where there's a lot of philosophy stuff, and you can discuss all this if you have some good ideas and advice. And that's kind of what happened. That's how I ended up having this conversation with Alastair Duckworth, because he reached out to me and asked if we could talk, because he realized I'm also very interested in a lot of ideas he's interested in. And I'm so glad that he did reach out, and I'm so glad that I can share it with you now, because we discuss all the stuff I was just rambling on about, but through a kind of clear example of design. Because Alastair is an award-winning designer, and he actually sees polarity as the key to creating a valuable brand campaign or a valuable advertising campaign. He's developed a way of thinking through it. He's in the middle of developing it even more. I'll let you listen to us and look at some of the links to his work to understand it more, but it's very fascinating. He's really thought through this idea of design and how polarity becomes almost the valuable thing within that practice if it's looked at from a certain way. So we had a really delightful conversation about it. And we talk about the potency of paradox, which again isn't dichotomy necessarily. Going beyond dichotomy is holding the paradox, I like to say. And here we talk about how paradox draws us in. It sort of alerts us to focus on what matters and sit with it, not try to resolve it, but understand it, see it, notice it. And we also talk about different kinds of design and ads. We talk about Michael Jordan. We talk about Airbnb ads, what they're trying to do. We talk about the original Beetle and lots more. So it's a wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoy this journey, and I hope wherever you are out there making your way, you're feeling good today. Keep on keeping on, as my dad likes to say. You'll find a couple videos that Alastair made and some other links to his work in the show notes. And if you want to help Love and Philosophy or support it in any way, There's many opportunities, and it really helps. So thanks for being here. Lots of love to you, and I hope you enjoy this. So we're just meeting for the first time. I just hit record. We had a few little sentences to each other, but I'm not even sure if I say your name right. Is it Alastair?
That is correct.
Okay.
And your surname, Andrea Hiott? Hiott. So I came across your video with Ian McGilchrist recently. That was the first time I'd come across you. And then I went to your YouTube page and saw that you had a whole, your YouTube channel was Beyond Dichotomies. And I was just curious how you got onto that subject.
How I got onto it?
Yeah, well, how that became a subject that was of such an interest to speak to loads and loads of people about it.
I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but two that come to mind. I moved a lot as a kid, so I saw a lot of things that seemed opposite but weren't really opposite, and so I was always trying to understand it in different ways in my family, but also in the schools I went to and things like that. For example, you might go to one school and something is cool, and at the next school the opposite is cool. But these similar patterns of the way things changed. I mean, I remember thinking about it back then, and then maybe because of that in part and other things, I studied Hegel in my first philosophy degree, and this dialectic Aufheben more. This it really struck me. I don't know if you've read Hegel in your work.
I've read sort of sections of him and pieces and quotes in various places, but
you don't have to read them. I mean, of course not. But there's something in there. I mean, it's usually called something like a dialectic or talked about as opposites that reconcile. But I think when you read it, it's an illustration of something maybe closer to what you're talking about, although I only watched your two videos that you sent me, but I think we'll get into it. But that it's more a pattern and a process than it is that there's one thing and another that are opposites that then do something like, there's not this dualistic conception. And so that's probably what started it. And then, I mean, from there, there's been tons of stuff that I've studied. Just, it intrigues me that there is this pattern that I've sensed of something kind of presenting itself to itself, only to realize it's not itself. It's something like this kind of, it's very hard to talk about in words, but that's what I've been trying to do. So this is Beyond Dichotomy. Like, how do we discuss that? So what about you? How did you get on Polarity? And is that the same thing?
I think, it's whether it's exactly the same, it's certainly in the same ballpark. When I was at university, so I studied design, graphic design, and the thing I was trying to get to the bottom of at the time was what makes a good piece of design? Is there something consistent across all pieces of design that we say is good? So that was one thing I was trying to do. And then the other thing I was trying to understand spiritual or religious experience. So what makes a deep or authentic religious experience?
Why were you trying to understand these two things? Were they connected at all? Or
so I come from a religious background. I guess at the age of 18, you're at the beginning of adulthood and you're beginning to think, how does everything that I grew up with fit into the person I want to be?
Was it kind of imposed on you, or it was just like you just grew up in it and didn't know any difference? And
so I come from a Christian family, and so that was the world I knew. I had enough experience of life that my community wasn't exactly the same as necessarily the world outside of it. So just going to school, you have that experience that there's quite a jar there, but as a kid, you're not necessarily sure exactly why that's going on. But then as you become an adult, you become conscious enough of your past experiences to begin to think, okay, how do I reconcile these things?
Yeah.
And then I'd been quite good at art at school. Design seemed an obvious direction to go in. And so I had this sort of very commercial form of art in the sense of design. And then this sort of trying to reconcile sort of spiritual experience. And so I had these disparate parts of myself that I was trying to put together. And I was trying to find some way. There were kind of two problems I was trying to solve at the same time. And I had this strange realization at some point that they had the answer, if not the same, was very similar to both of them, that involved some form of paradox. So I was reading Pascal, and a lot of his language is very paradoxical, and I was really drawn to it, and I found that the sort of things that didn't make sense in religious writing and experience were the ones that really appealed to me, and I couldn't work out why that was. And then at the same time, I was finding the same thing in design, that the pieces of work that really resonated with me were the ones that seemed to not make sense on some level, seemed to contradict themselves.
Can you give me an example? Because that's paradox too is another word that's been, yeah, something I come back to again and again, and that it expresses something, but it also expresses something beyond itself. So I wonder about I don't really understand the art. I guess, are you thinking more in design? Or because I know you're doing branding and stuff now, were you already thinking about that? Like what gets the response that maybe you want or that a customer wants or something, and that's kind of the thing that was paradoxical? Or was it that something is said to be beautiful but it's actually the opposite? Or I don't know, like what were you?
Yeah. I think there's certainly, if something's or seemingly contradictory or paradoxical, it gets your attention, and so you'll look at it. If it seems to not resolve itself, that will get your attention. But then I was finding that even in things that, even beyond that, if a piece of work was particularly good, it would still retain that paradoxical feel even beyond the moment that you'd interact with it. I mean, there's one advert.
So you mean it like wouldn't resolve itself?
It wouldn't
Like
resolve
it
itself.
keeps drawing you back in, kind of.
Yes,
thing.
you kind of get stuck with it, but it wouldn't be a bad sort of stuck. It would be a pleasing kind of stuck. I mean, one that's an advert that you'll resonate with is the old VW Beetle ads.
Yeah, I saw that in your video. Of course, I wrote a whole book about it, so for similar reasons. Yeah.
I mean, they're masterful at how they take something that's a negative and turn it into a positive.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
But there was an old Nike advert with Michael Jordan where he's walking down a corridor, and he's saying again and again how he's failed in his career. He's saying, I've missed all these shots, I've failed, I've lost all these games, etc., etc. And he says, I fail over and over and over again, and that's why I succeed. And so that gets your attention. But then it leaves you with that sort of strange problem of failing and succeeding. They kind of are, they do go together, and yet they don't. And so just this recognition that not only is it really great, it's a great way of getting someone's attention, but beyond that, it's actually a really good way. If you can find a paradox in something, it's actually a really good way of finding the value in the thing. And so it also becomes kind of an authentic way of doing advertising or brand communication. But if you can get to that point where you've found the paradox, you've actually got the point of where something is meaningful and valuable. And so if that's what you're selling, then it seems to me to be the most authentic way of selling something.
That's really interesting that that's where the value is. I agree with you, but I also feel like I need to dig into it a little bit more from your point of view. Or, I mean, in a way, you've said attention a lot. It gets your attention, and of course, this is something that we try to do in our branding, or even now. I mean, I think of technology and how all technology is sort of built, or social media kind of apps to get your attention, and it's almost become, it's a different kind of get your attention maybe than I think what you're talking about. So
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's often this disingenuous way of getting your attention. I mean, and I think that's a loser's game.
But what's the difference there? Because I think it's an important one, because I think what draws me to paradox, and when it draws me to thinking about all these themes, is that it's extended. It's like, that's why the beyond dichotomy, it's extending me, or what I think of as myself, beyond what I thought of as myself. And that's the weird paradox of it. Whereas the other kind of attention that I was just talking about, where something takes your attention, but there's not an extension, there's a narrowing, or it's almost kind of, there's this feeling of collapsing or something, or pressurization or something like that.
Yeah, it kind of hijacks you, and then you realize, well, I think a lot of the time you can make a contradiction that just has no good resolution. And so you can present a message to someone that just doesn't gel in any way. So it sort of upsets your rational mind, but then there's nothing beyond that. And so it gets you looking, but then afterwards, well, it makes you quite frustrated. So it's not,
it sort of disturbs you or something,
or it irritates you. You think, why that company had no right to get my attention like that. They got my attention, but that was all they were trying to do. There's nothing beyond that. But I think when paradox is used really well, it's the paradox is in the subject, and when that gets your attention, it's not something that's bolted on. It's not just hijacking you. It's actually present within the thing, and so you're hitting the outer edge of that paradox, and then it draws you in more and more.
Yeah, for me, it's almost like the process itself is unveiling something, or
Yes.
there's a kind of doubling that then you move beyond doubling. I just wrote something about this, which I'll have to share with you.
Yeah, I do.
But yeah, there's a way in which it's not that it's in the thing, but it's like, or for me, maybe for you, it's not that there's some kind of thing that's a contradiction that's in the thing, but somehow the way that you're interacting with it in a certain sense of awareness is that pattern or movement of paradox, or setting yourself against yourself, or even just the interaction with what is outside of you. You think it's outside of you, but of course, as Merleau-Ponty would say, we're always, everything we touch is touching us. Everything we see is see. So there's always this kind of, you're already part of the thing, and there's something about that I think is really tied to this, the way we use the paradox or the contradiction to see that clearly, or like illuminate that, elucidate that. I don't know if that connects to your.
Well, let me try something. So to go back to the Nike advert. So when you have the punchline essentially to the advert of "I failed over and over again, and that is why I win," do we resonate with that because that's something we know from our own experience is true to some extent, and it's kind of putting its finger. The advert's putting its finger on it. It's sort of articulating the sort of rational absurdity of that, and yet it's true. Does that connect with what you're saying, that it's
but
already in you when you, and so it tells you what you already know in a sense, but just clears it, but both makes it clearer and shows you how bizarre that is. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, but I think like just as what I that ad for me would be that you're expecting a particular thing because the regularities are that Michael Jordan is successful. That's what you've encountered up to that moment.
Yeah.
And to hear him say that he's failed upsets that. So that it's that movement against, like, so you're moving in one direction, you're kind of have a expectation, and then what you're offered is the kind of not the opposite of that. So you have to recalibrate and think about it. And then there's also just what I think you're getting at more too, is that we all understand what it is to fail or to want success, or this process. So when there's a kind of also a connection with him that, oh, he's failed too. So you have both of it, right? You have this kind of jolting awakening of attention. And then you also have this, at the same time, this opening of a connection between the two of you, that you've shared something, because who hasn't understood failure? And so now you see that the most successful man by some standard has. And so there's both of those at once, I guess.
Yes,
I think with Think Small, it's a similar kind of turn. It's a keto, or it's a kind of, there's something about, the energy use there that is really powerful, and that you see in, a lot of different parts of life, I think.
Yeah, very much so. I think, and I do think there's an honesty about it as well, because when you find out how the opposites relate, it's kind of like a small little moment of enlightenment. It's not, you don't feel, oh, I've been tricked. You feel, I've seen something.
And what is that? What is that enlightenment? Because I think that's what I was trying to get out of it. Takes you out of yourself, but you're more yourself than you were. You're present, but it's done something for you that's kind of given you a different perception in a way. Yeah. Or a wider perception. I'm not sure what language to put on that.
I think you feel in your imagination the coming together of the paradox into a polarity. So you have the paradox is your rational mind being upset by the polarity. So there's some deep truth there. Your rational mind can't deal with it, and so it turns it into a paradox, or experiences a paradox. And so, but it's still at the same time, it does know that there's something true there. So it's like an itch you can't scratch enough. And then, but that moment where your imagination joins the two, and your rational, like your left brain, kind of recognizes that that it's gone as far as it can go and it has to kind of hand it over to the right brain. The right brain has this moment where the two unite and then it creates a new whole, a new thing. And then
You sound very Hegelian, by the way, right now.
Okay. And then it kind of you kind of have this moment of being slightly woken up because everything, there's a sense of that unity, but also the distinction between the unity, and you're just slightly more alive than you were a moment ago. And it's just an inherently pleasurable experience of that, being a little bit more alive.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about what you mean by polarity, because you just kind of said as if it's not paradox. So, and polarity is very important to your work. You're working on this new branding and educational platform or something. Maybe you can tell me a little bit, but as I understood it from the intro videos that you sent me, it's very much about a different idea of this polarity, but maybe you can define what you mean by that too. And
so I'm borrowing terms that I found elsewhere, which I found useful to me. Polarity being a relationship, a creative relationship between opposites that you'd find in a magnet, or positive and negative charge. So these pairs of opposites that exist throughout the universe in their various different ways.
So right there, you're kind of saying, okay, there are such things as opposites.
Yes.
That exist, and they're sort of that's a kind of basic thing for you, that you think there are opposites. Are they the same opposites for everyone? Do you think there's some kind of objective opposite, like
very much
good
so?
and bad?
So I think the universe is constructed out of relationships between opposites. So whether that's north and south, positive, negative, male, female, masculine, feminine, light, dark, day, night, summer, winter, all those different things. It seems that these are the sort of fundamental principles out of which everything comes.
Okay, I would probably disagree with that, but we can come back.
Brilliant, then tell me. Go for it.
I just don't. I think we as we develop and we do language, we learn language, and all of these kind of ways that we've developed, we need ways of communicating, and we do put things from our perspective into this kind of oppositional way of thinking. We do take extremes of a spectrum and sort of say that they're opposites, and it's actually very helpful, this binary kind of way. I mean, even our technology is built on that, but I don't think my opposites are the same at every scale and nested level of life. And also what's opposites for me aren't really opposites when I look into them. You can't really get to a point where there's a definite this and a definite that are against each other. So for me, I'm always trying to unstick it a bit from, it's not that the world is somehow set up in opposition things, but rather that as humans in our development through our communication and language, due to this kind of pattern that we're talking about, right? That there is a way in which it feels like we're against something and resolved with something, against something and resolved with something. That sort of patterning leads us to talk in opposites, or arrange our language in opposites, or dualisms.
Yes.
And then we kind of take those as if that's the way it is, but I don't think that's actually the way it is. I think that's what we've done to be able to understand this ongoing process that actually isn't oppositional. But that sounds a bit different from what you were saying, but connected.
So I distinguish between something being polarized and it being a dichotomy. So for me, a polarity is something that has both distinction and union at the same time. And so you couldn't separate the two poles of a magnet and into two separate north and separate south. You wouldn't have a magnet anymore. I mean, the magnet, if you were to cut it in half, you just end up with two. And so in each of those situations, I feel that there's an implicit unity and a more explicit duality. And so I'm certainly not separating. Certainly don't see the world as made up of dualisms or dualities. I don't know if that's closer to where you'd be in that.
Yeah, I think it's more just this. I guess I'm wondering if you see it as relational. I mean, even the magnet is an interaction that would have different interactions depending on what context it was in terms of, like, if we take it to the moon or something, I don't know. But so I guess it's just like, how do you see the context? It's actually to your first question that you asked when you were 18 or whatever. Is there some kind of good art, or I'm not sure how you phrased it, like one kind of art that's right or good? You could correct me as to what you were really thinking. For me, the answer to that question is yes, from each position at each kind of spatiotemporal moment, but it's only a measurement, and that's worthy of something. But Yeah, it's not like we can say, okay, here's good art and it's going to be good art for like ever and it's good art
Sure.
from every position and all of this.
Yes. No,
Yeah.
I completely agree that it's relational. And I suppose what I'm applying is just a model of reality. And so that model's never going to be how reality is. And it's always going to be infinitely more complex than I can possibly imagine. And
Mm.
so it's just me trying to get a handle on some sort of principle that seems to be operating there. And so it's more that when I'd approach a piece of art or a piece of design and think, that's good, I then think, okay, well, why is it good? And then I'd find, whether I'd always find, but seemingly invariably, I'd find that there'd be some sort of tension between two different subject matters, which were both distinct in some that appeared to be distinct from each other, but had some sort of union. And so that would be that'd be something that just seemed to work, and more definitely so in design and advertising, where things have to be a bit more simple and explicit. Whereas art, it's by nature is more mysterious and has to be, or ought to be perhaps. But
What
in
about something like
advertising,
Bauhaus or Rietveld or
say again.
what about something like Bauhaus kind of style or Rietveld or where, I mean, do you see a tension in something like that's so meant to be so designed so simplistically that for me it's almost like it's meant to not so that you don't feel any of that polarity. It's almost like trying to be a vacuum to polarity so that you just,
Maybe it's a very left brain thing. I don't know, the Bauhaus creativity, but even something like, would it be comparable to Apple style of design?
Yeah, it's
Style is
coming
the
from
right
that
word.
same tradition, I guess. Yeah.
You've got something, you've got simplicity and complexity working together always. And so you don't want a computer just to be simple. You don't want it to be complicated. You want it to sort of mediate between or hold those two together. And so that it can do very complex things, but do it in as simple a way as possible. And so I feel that the value of, say, a piece of Apple technology is that it's doing that particularly well. I mean, it's doing other things as well. It's managing to be both tech and human, so sort of mechanical and organic at the same time through the sort of particular design features and sensibility that's gone into it. But
Mm. Something like a chair, maybe like an Eames chair or something. Would you say that's also doing that
you,
simple complex? That
maybe not simple
you've
complex,
understood
but
something
maybe.
so well that you can make it look simple or something like that? Is it?
Well, you certainly want to use. You want it to do as be as good as possible at what at the thing it's trying to achieve, but with the minimum amount of effort. There's a saying from one of the who's it, Abram Games, who did a lot of the World War II posters or World War One sort of propaganda war posters.
Oh, yeah, I
Who
don't know. I don't know those specific.
you probably recognize them if you saw them, but
Okay.
he has this expression of maximum meaning, minimum means. And so you're trying to get across as much as possible with the least amount of elements. And I feel that
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to make as comfortable a chair as possible. So comfort would be one thing, but then the minimum amount of materials or the simplest use of materials. And so I think that tension would be there for the designer thinking, because you could just make a square box, but that wouldn't be nice to sit on. If you could have one piece of wood but shape it in a particular way, like the Eames chair, then you're achieving that human comfortable side of the polarity, but also the material minimum materials side. And if I was to say, how could you make a better chair? My approach to doing that would be, well, how could I reduce the amount of materials I've got here, but still make it an even nicer chair to sit in? So achieve that human need even better.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing of it not being in the thing itself, but the process that of polarity that like if you're going to create the Eames chair, it's helpful to think in the polarities that you just described. But I wouldn't say the chair itself is embodying that polarity so much. I mean,
Okay.
if any, but it doesn't actually matter because what you're talking about is the creative process, right? And
Yeah.
and how we learn and education, and so that process is what you're uh talking about. The polarity being, you're kind of rethinking it, right? I think you mentioned Aristotle and this like golden mean, and so we have this conception of there being opposites, right? Or there being these two extremes, and then we go in the middle, and that's like
Yes.
the right way. And there's many others, not just Aristotle, this kind of idea that you go in the middle, and that's the safe zone. And you're kind of saying, no, actually, that's not how creativity happens.
Well, I don't think that's how anything happens. I think that's where things go to die.
It's
So
like stasis or something.
yeah,
It's just kind of
absolutely.
where the pendulum stops swinging.
Precisely, and that's safe in one sense because it's not moving, but it's also
Mhm.
dead. No, I was sure. So I read Aristotle's the sort of section in his Nicomachean Ethics, which you never say, where he talks about the golden mean. Or no, I mean he talks about the mean. It later becomes the golden mean, and he's always talking about it. He's always talking about how a virtuous act is always found through avoiding the either of the extremes, the too much or the too little.
Mhm.
And I was thinking, surely he's not really saying that. But the more I looked into his writings, the more it seems that he is saying that you want to avoid extremes, and so you end up in the situation where I guess a tightrope is quite a good analogy because
Mhm.
on a tightrope you don't want to fall off one side, you don't want to fall off the other. But the trouble is that all the energy and all the life is at the extremes, and
Mhm.
so one of the things I found interesting was that, say, for courage, he says that you don't want to be reckless, you don't want to be cowardly, you want to aim between the two. But actually, if you put the two together, then taking necessary risk, if as long as you do that, then if you're also safe, that won't be cowardly, it would just be sensible. And if you're safe and then you take risk, do what would otherwise be reckless, then actually that becomes a good risk to take. And so
So
the
you're
more
saying you don't have to choose between these or try to stay in the
you,
middle, but you can have both at once. It's just how you're.
you can have both at once, and they raise each other up, and so they transform each other into virtues in themselves. And so cowardice becomes actually no, just self-preservation, and that's a really good thing. And recklessness becomes, well, no, doing something dangerous but in a sensible way, and that's a really good thing. And so the extremes actually sort of cross-fertilize each other and lift each other up into something else.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like this Aufheben. Again, I
Yeah.
mean, we started with Hegel, so of course I'm now reading it through it. But
Um,
I just like just to push at it a little bit because I agree with this, and I mean this process is completely fascinating for me, and
me too.
I haven't thought of it in design since I wrote the book, but when I was writing the book about Bill Bernbach and DDB, I was thinking of it a lot because, of course, I mean, that whole book is about this because you have this Volkswagen Beetle,
Yeah.
which starts, to me, it was a sign of two opposites, because I knew it as a summer of love. And
Yeah.
then suddenly I learned, oh, it had started in Hitler's Germany.
Yeah.
And to me, it was like, how did this happen? So it was this whole process that motivated that book, let me just say. But bracketing that, like, I do want to think about it a bit because as you're talking, I'm thinking about the Stoics, for example, or different, even some like Buddhist things are coming to mind, and Tao. And when we are in life and things are can be such a struggle for us, like with these things, when we're not just talking about them philosophically, but for
Yeah.
example, we are feeling some extreme sadness or extreme jealousy or anger, or all these things that really frustrate us and hurt us, or just someone's hurt us, right? Then this balancing or this kind of what you call kind of deadening isn't actually deadening so much as getting some poise away from all of that intensity,
Yes.
recalibrating, finding your poise.
Yes.
Yeah, how do you is there a space where that's also good? Do you always want to be holding both at the same time and in this creative space that you're of polarity?
I mean, you could present that as another polarity in terms of being in the intensity and not being in the intensity, and being
That's what I mean
having,
by this is a kind of method, right? You could kind of apply it to anything
yeah.
if
Well,
yeah,
that's what I found anyway.
right. But it's not that's different than saying there's some kind of ontological, like we can look at we can just kind of point to this in the world. It's more like this is a good way to understand this ongoing world. Maybe not.
I guess
Yeah.
I feel there is some objectivity to it. I don't
Okay.
feel that it's just a
I'd
subjective
like to
thing.
hear about that because I think I was trying to get a bit to the other second question you had too about these, God and these bigger
Yeah.
questions because that's a big question when you are talking about this,
Yes, it is.
because you have that's built on a kind of a polarity that it's hard for me to see how you resolve it in this way that you're describing of go into the polarities. Like, so I would like to, yeah, maybe we can move up into that a bit, but you see it as in the world. It's really objective. This
I do. I don't. How do I put it? So a polarity that often comes up is the relationship between freedom and constraint, and how you need to have a certain amount of order, but also you need to be able to break that order or have something other than the order in order for things to be alive or healthy or good or whatever. And you could say, well, is freedom something that's real? Is it, or is it just something that's in your mind? And to me, freedom seems to be something that's kind of more real than the physical world, in the sense that you might say love is more real than physical objects. But then it seems that many of the things, what someone might think of objects in the physical world, in some sense, they have a reality to them that's beyond what's physical. And so if you take an object, like, I don't know, a table, you can think of a table in a very sort of left-brained way of sort of get a rational concept of a table as this, but you can also go into it and think, actually, a table is a process of doing something. It's a dynamic idea. And the table is always, at one point, it's lifting up off the ground. It's also stabilizing and providing a surface for things to be on. And that is an ongoing thing that it's doing. And so there's a sense in which there's the physical table. I'm probably using all the wrong term. I'm probably making a mess of this as I try and explore it, but it's very abstract. Then there's the physical reality that you can go to with your senses. But then there's something that's beyond that, that's more real than the actual table, which is the sort of dynamic process of the table. And so I suppose I feel that polarities get into that realm where you're going, and very often polarities, they don't have that sort of physical object level of reality to them. They certainly don't have a paradox would be the sort of concept version of them, where it just seems like that doesn't make sense. That's illogical. They don't have a physical object in the world that you can attach them to sometimes, but they do exist at that level of living dynamic idea. And so like freedom and constraint seem to be a living principle that goes through everything. And so it has an objectivity to it. It's present in everything, but you couldn't say, there it is, that's an object, that's a thing that you can look at. Is that getting any way towards tackling your question?
Well, I mean, so this freedom constraint thing is also something I've thought a lot about, especially in that same book, that because, even just looking at the politics of the time, and it's all about this different balance between being constrained or being told what to do, or we won't go into the politics, or freedom. And I guess what I would say now, just after hearing what you said, is I would say that the freedom or the constraint is a measurement of this ongoing process. So you've brought up the brain and this left-right way of thinking again. So if I try to put it in that sense, like the ongoing process would be maybe more what you mean by the right brain's kind of, or that way in which it is just this ongoing process. But then we do impose some kind of order on that in order to communicate about it and understand, like the table, right? So we call it a table, and there's all the stuff, but that stuff is real, but it's not more real or less real or any of that, but it's a form of communication that is meaningful in the moment that it's being used for the people that are using it, but it doesn't like necessarily, it can change, and it's not like a part of the table in the sense of that you can go look at it with a microscope, but it is part of our interaction with each other and the table, just in the sense that it's this patterning, that's what language is too, this patterning that we've developed in order to have the space where we can communicate about it. So we create the space of something like constraints with language or regularities. This is what a table is, so that we can talk about it. But of course, when you look in time and space, it's all one ongoing process that can be looked at from many different scales and so on. So I guess to try to think about this like polarity, I feel like you're using it in a practical way. Like for you, it's about, or maybe I'm wrong. Is it about, that's why I brought up the religion thing too. Is it a portal for you to experience that world without the names and without the constraints? Or is it a way for you to start to put some order on it and notice the patterns and create something maybe in that kind of space, or both. I mean, probably both if we're talking about paradox here, but
An example I like from branding, which might help me to communicate what I think goes on. So the company Airbnb, they're from one angle, they're producing they're a tech platform that connects lots of different hosts from around the world so that people can go and travel to physical properties and stay in them. But they've sort of drilled down to what they're all about, and they describe that as helping people to belong anywhere. And actually, everything that they do is trying to reach in one direction to anywhere, so that they'll take you anywhere in the world. So they're always going about the exciting and varied different properties that you can go and stay in. But they're also trying to they're trying to work with hosts in order that travelers, tourists can feel that when they go to these places, they have some sense of belonging. And so these are two ideas which there's some sort of objectivity to them, and that happens to also be the value of the core of the value of their company is pushing and also pulling these opposites together and making those manifest in every possible place that they operate. And so if that could be at a particular destination, they're thinking, okay, how do we pull these ideas together? It could be on their website that they're building. How do we pull these ideas together so that we're showing a range of different things, but also making people feel like they would belong there if they went there. And so they've kind of hit upon this thing that's beyond words, although they're summing it up with words, because the paradox that comes out of that is very good for sort of creating that sort of jarring, attention-grabbing quality. But they're hitting upon something that's objective, that's beyond words, that happens to also be the source of the value of everything that they do. So I don't know if that's getting...
Mm-hmm. I mean, these words are tricky for a philosopher, objective, for example, but instead of having some kind of philosophical debate about it, I think I know what you're saying.
It's not solipsistic. It's not.
Yeah.
So the ideas of belonging.
It's shared. It's connected and shared or something.
It's real. Yeah. No, I don't know. There's something real about it. There's something that's real, that they are manifesting something real that happens to be that relationship between these opposite forces.
I agree with you. I'm just pulling it out a bit because I'm not like belonging and being anywhere. Those to me don't seem like the polarities or the opposites.
Okay.
It's more that our development up to this point, we think of home as one static place. So
yeah,
what I see happening is that and again, this is different according to different cultures. I lived in Mongolia for a long time, and there were a lot of nomadic people still there, and would be different for them. Yeah. But from my perspective, right, I grew up sort of thinking home is one place. It's static, and of course we moved a lot, so that was disruptive in that way. It was unusual and disruptive to that. Yes. In the same way that I think you're talking about home anywhere, belonging anywhere sounds disruptive, but yes. It's not that home and belonging anywhere or belonging and being anywhere are disruptive. It's that the orientation with which we've developed in the world is opposing to what they're presenting to us. So they're presenting to us, you can belong anywhere. Whereas we've thought we have one home and you belong there, and it feels, it's, so that for me is more that process of doubling or dialectic or polarity or paradox. All those mean different things, but do you see what I mean? So I'm agreeing with you, but I think I'm putting it in
slightly different terms.
Yeah, maybe.
I suppose that in their situation, they can't provide you a home. And so they're trying to find the most appropriate words to capture as quickly as possible something that they can own and market and all that sort of thing. I suppose due to the nature of being a human, you are constrained by physical space and location, all these different things. And wherever, and if you want to belong, you can't spread yourself out in all kinds of different directions. And so if you're always traveling around, it's very hard to belong anywhere. Well, it's very hard to belong. And so they found a tension in human experience that we all experience to some degree, but seems to be it's an there's an objectivity to that subjective experience that we all participate in. That you can't the more spread out you are as a person, the harder it's going to be to have that sense of really having a home or really belonging somewhere.
Yeah, I think of meditative practices, or what's that?
Am I missing? Am I just missing your point?
No. We're just discussing it. It's just interesting to look at it from different levels. But I think as you were talking, I was thinking about, well, now, and we move so much, and I told you I moved a lot as a kid, and you learn how to belong. Belonging becomes an orientation that doesn't depend on the external circumstances, because that's your reality. And more people, I think, are having to figure that out these days. Or even if we look at something like belonging to groups online, which you could kind of be anywhere. So there's a lot of different ways we could look at all that. And I think that's true about any of these subjects, but that doesn't take away from the same thing you brought up with the ad with Michael Jordan. I mean, this pattern I see in all the stuff that you brought up, that something is being presented against itself in a way, and that's where this creative tension is, or that's where the success is, I guess.
And then the
in
value,
terms of
just,
so you think it's actual?
There seems to be, it's where it's most alive, it's most real, it's most valuable. Well, and those things all seem to be different ways of looking at the same. Well, it has the most. It seems to be just all different facets of the same thing. It's most true. Good.
Well, I guess, what do you think about authenticity, for example? Or because again, I brought up that social media thing of trying to take our attention, and you can do the same thing then, right? You present someone with something that's completely like that stops them in the way of the examples that you've given, in the sense of feeling like a polarity, and then you have them, and then something like haptics on the iPhone, right? I mean, in a way, that was a kind of a moment of polarity that then you just sort of, you can become to where your attention is just taken in a more like addictive sense, or that you're just fascinated. And I'm not sure that's kind of the same exact,
I think,
process, but
well, in terms of authenticity, I don't know if this is quite where you were thinking, but you can certainly get someone's attention in an inauthentic way, and just use this idea to do that in a way that's disingenuous, that has no care or concern for your audience.
I guess when you were talking about how it's valuable, that's what I was talking, like how this is where life is, this is where what matters is, that you said something like that about.
Yeah.
So that's where I was thinking about the authenticity, because I agree, right? That's what we've been talking about. That's why I'm fascinated by the subject. This is where, this is life in a way, and this is where all the things we remember when we die happen in this space in a way.
Yeah.
That's why, but as you're saying, and I'll let you continue now, but there is a way in which you can use polarities and paradox and all this stuff that we're talking about that isn't alive and in that space, and so on and so forth. So that's why I guess it's kind of like intention maybe then, instead of authenticity. When you're a brand, when you're a creator, when you're making something, how much does it matter that you're aware of what effect you're trying to get, I guess?
I guess there's a major problem with how we do business and branding these days, which is that we just see people as consumers. And so we're not trying to do what's good for them most of the time. We're trying to do what gets the highest return, and what keeps them coming back, because there's some level of addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so we don't do what is good. That's not even considered part of the process. It's simply a means to commercial end. And this is what's frightening about big tech companies offering amazing opportunities and services, is we all know deep down that they don't have our good in mind. They don't care about us. And so I'm very idealistically trying to think, well, what if a business or brand were to do real good? What would it be doing? And so what it would be doing would be to find the appropriate polarities within what it's offering, and find the best way to communicate that and serve that in a way that will connect with their customer rather than consumer, and build something of lasting value that continues to be of use and meaning for that person, makes them feel a little bit more alive in its small way. provides value for them in its small way, doesn't overreach and therefore try and turn them into an addict that just keeps returning.
So this is part of what your polarity branding or what you're trying to create.
Yes, and
I'm trying to get at that. You're coming at it from.
And so,
what's your motivation there?
Well, my motivation is that I would like to use design to do good, in as much as that's possible. And so then you have the question of what does it mean to do good? What is good in that context? And so just drilling down into those things brought me to the point where I thought, well, behind a product or service or an organization, there are always these pairs of opposites, and that's what really people are wanting to participate in. And so in the Airbnb situation, a person wants to participate in the experience of belonging in an unusual place. And if you bring together that recipe of ideas, then you make them that little bit more alive. And that you can do a genuine good to them in that sense. You can expand what it means to be a human being. And so that's certainly a side of it. Another side of it is that one of the major problems working in design is that you have a clash of subjective interests. And so, for example, if I was to create a logo and it was red, and I present it to you and I say, I like red, and you say, well, I like blue. And then we can't agree because it's just your preference versus mine. And a lot of talk about certainly art, but also design is sort of degraded into this just personal preference. We don't really believe there's any sort of objective principle to the rules of design or art. We just think it's whatever I happen to like. And that creates a major problem. I mean, it completely devalues the process of design, certainly, because if it's just what I happen to like, well, why is my preference any better than yours? I can't be an expert in anything. And so that's a problem. And so how do you find the objective thing? And if the polarity is actually the what lies behind the value of what you do, well, then we can have a conversation about it. Because if we explore everything you're doing, what you're producing, what you're making, and we can find these pairs of opposites, well, then we can sort of together work out which ones are the really important ones. Then we can stop having subjective conversations so much. We can say, like, we can work together and say, okay, what we're doing is we're trying to help people belong anywhere. So what would that look like if we're building a web platform? What would that look like if we're helping a host to prepare their home in such a way that it would achieve that goal? And so then together we can creatively solve the problem, and we can have our different skills and our different objectives, but we can work together rather than against each other. And this is so often what happens, is that designers end up fighting their clients because they're playing this subjectivity game, which is extremely frustrating for everybody and prevents you doing good work. And then I guess a final thing about it is that when you bring opposites together, it creates really interesting work. It creates the possibility of the sort of Michael Jordan advert or the Think Small adverts, because you're thinking, okay, we have this polarity. Of course, there is a unity with these things, but actually, in order to have that unity, we have to have also the distinction between the parts. You have to be able to say, we're not just, if you want to talk about success, then actually maybe talking about failure is a really good way of doing that. And maybe we could really lean into failure in order to talk about success. Or if you really want to belong somewhere, you could talk about how to make that very seemingly really unlikely or really difficult. And so it just becomes a much more interesting process when you're dealing with the polarity rather than what you like and what I like. Or even just a more sort of rational brief of we're trying to get as much attention as possible for this particular brand on this particular platform. It feels like you're really getting down to the essence of things, the sort of first principles of things. I've rambled a great deal there.
It was wonderful. I think that's what I was trying to ask about authenticity, that you just kind of explained that. And I like trying to imagine what it's like being in the design studio or whatever, because I can completely see what you're saying of how it could just get about trying to please each other or trying to do what the client is going to think is cool. And that's a completely different thing than, that the values and what's going to come out of it. So it's almost like, as you're describing, it sounds to me like it's a practice or a way to learn how to think about design differently.
Absolutely.
It's a cognitive practice that you're building here. And we should go into it a little more. First, I should say, because we've been mentioning Think Small by DDB. And the thing, in case anyone who doesn't know, there was this kind of time when everyone was using giant big cars, and it was like, you know, keep up with the Joneses, and all the ads were these beautiful, huge cars, the bigger, the better. And then you had this ad, I'm generalizing in an incredible way, but in terms of the patterns we've been talking about, then you had this ad that was pretty much just white, like nothing, and a little small car, and it said Think Small. So not only did it go completely against what everyone else was doing when advertising, it also spoke to the themes like what you were just describing. It was much deeper. It was connecting to society. This was countercultural era and stuff. So it had all that, what you were talking about. It was, you know, looking at the polarity and then making the most of it towards what people wanted at that time.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that, but I want to get into the polarity a bit from your point of view, because I know we were talking about how it's not about temperance. It's not about the middle path. And this side of it, I'm not sure I understand yet from our conversation, because in the videos you kind of say, you know, there's no, we worry about post-truth, but really it's half-truth, or we worry about like polarization, but what we need to do, you kind of just mentioned it a little bit, we need to really lean into it and go deep into the polarization. Yes. Which can sound very dangerous, you know, if you're not coming at it from this place that we've been talking about. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit, like what's that part of it?
Well, firstly, I'm trying to get someone's attention with that.
Okay, so you're doing your own method with that.
Yeah. I'm doing my own method. I'm trying to jar people.
Very smart.
But in terms of polarization, so I do think polarities are real, as in I do think they're a part of life, the universe, and everything. The way we use the term polarization, I don't think is actually quite right, or at least it's come to mean something that's not technically right to the original term. And so, if something is polarized, it means that it's just like the north and south poles of magnets. It has an explicit duality, but an implicit unity. Whereas what it means now is that things are just separated. So there's a duality there. And so I'm trying to, on one level, recapture that language. I'm also making the most of the fact that it's got that new meaning or developed meaning, which is just pretty much wholly a negative thing. So I'm trying to create that sort of little bit of paradigm shift and saying, actually, no, we want to have as much polarization as possible, because if you have genuine polarization, then you partake of both values of either end of the spectrum. And what keeps them healthy is that they have that underlying unity, and therefore they're not trying to simply destroy each other. They constructively create each other. And so, yeah, there's those two things going on of me getting attention using the perceived negative connotation, but then also trying to redeem that expression. And I guess the same with extremism. I'm trying to say you need a positive form of extremism, because
that's quite a statement.
I do think it's the only solution to the sort of negative forms of extremism we have, is that we've got to a situation where in so many ways society has separated into its extremes without having any relationship. And the solution is not to find that moderate middle ground, because that has no life and energy. There's nothing to aspire to in the middle, apart from, again, you've got this problem of avoidance. You're trying to say, well, I'm not extreme left, I'm not extreme right. And so you build you create a position for yourself where you're just avoiding things. And so that's very uninspiring. Whereas if you could say, well, no, there's something right about that extreme direction, there's something right about the other extreme direction. It's just that they need to communicate with each other. And obviously that, of course, that's very idealistic, but I think the principle does work. I think that there will be something right at either end, as long, and again, you're back to the situation where it's either reckless or cowardice. Well, actually, no, if they talk to each other, one becomes necessary risk-taking, the other one becomes self-preservation. And so they raise each other's game by being related. What was the other thing I was going to say? I was just escaping my mind. Probably come back to me in a bit.
Well, when it comes back, I like it better when you talk about holding them both at once in the same space rather than going into the extremes, because to me that sounds like we just become more in our silo, or we just whatever we don't try to have any middle ground in any way or use of that term, which can often just mean conversation or like sharing. I think, of course, coming from the States, of politics, right? And if you this has been incredibly polarized in a sense of,
Yeah,
if you support one person or the other, it becomes very hard to even sit at the dinner table together as a
yeah,
family.
yeah.
And so in that case, it's very hard for me to understand that going further into those extremes would be helpful, unless everyone at that table had this understanding of what we're talking about now. And that most people don't, let's be
No,
honest.
no,
So
absolutely.
if everyone had this understanding that actually opposites aren't opposites and they all meet together, and
Yeah,
that we could sort of explore, we could go deep, lean into what we're feeling and explore that, and probably end up connecting with what we think is our opposite. If
yeah.
we understood that sort of movement and that meditation, yeah, I would agree with you. But I don't think most people think through that. And not that they
Absolutely.
couldn't, but, and if you're not thinking through that and you're just going to do what you said, which is golden extremism, or go, this going deeper into the polarization, I don't see how that's actually what going to do anything positive in the way that you're describing.
The
Does
two
that make
things
sense
there.
to you, that it depends
Yes,
how you are thinking about how much you've understood this process? To
definitely. I guess there's two things there for me. One is it a good thing to do objectively? And I think yes, it is. I think if you to take the extremes, and to, even if you can hold the relationship together to make them more extreme, I think that's a good thing.
if you're holding them in the same
If you
space, right?
absolutely
Which isn't what most people do.
but I think
That's
there's two
almost
things
goes the
there.
opposite of what we think of it as,
Uh,
right?
whether people can do it, I think that's another question. And so, should people go to the extremes if they're not holding them together? No, because that would just be destructive. But I think well, I believe it is the case that embracing both the extremes and pushing them more to the extremes at the same time is a good thing and is a true thing. It is true that if you do that, I think things will get better. It's worth knowing that. And so if someone wants to uh, be an extreme sports enthusiast, they're going to want to be pushing the risk as much as they possibly can. But in order to do that, they have to drive towards safety as much as they possibly can. And knowing that's a really useful thing, because knowing that frees them up to be better at what they want to do. I think that in terms of the conversation at the dinner table, if people, I think a useful paradigm shift is that opposite things can both be true at the same time. And so you could kind of agree with each other that, well, my opinion, we completely disagree, but what I believe is true, and what you believe is true. It's just that they're in conflict with each other. Of course, there's going to be a degree of truth between the two of us, but just to know that actually two opposite things can be true at the same time is a very helpful thing to know, because then you can begin to think, okay, well, how can this and this work together at once? On the half truths thing, which was the thing that escaped my mind, that was something I got from Whitehead, where he's often saying that he says a number of places that if half truths are treated as whole truths, it plays the devil in society. And so when we take one side of the spectrum and say that is the thing, then that is just a half truth. Now it's very valuable because it is true, but it's only half of the total truth. And so as long as you have both of those things, then you've got the full picture. And I do feel that a lot of the time, our problem with truth is that we've devolved into just lots of half truths, and we've lost the ability to see two things to be true at the same time and therefore hold them together. And the way to move beyond that is to firstly see that two things that are opposed can both be true, and then to begin to work out, well, how can that happen, and how can we put them back together without going straight to the middle and just being in the safe moderate place, which is where nothing is alive, nothing is exciting, nothing's productive. And so it's me trying. So I'm trying to do a number of things. I'm trying to firstly, I'm trying to work through that process, but also I'm trying to slightly upset people by presenting it in terms which are going to be a bit shocking in order to get attention, because I'm a designer, and so therefore that's what I do.
Yeah, no, as we said, it's kind of an illustration of some of what we've been talking about. It's just, I do think we're talking about it in wider terms than just design, and that's why I really think we need some nuance about using the word like extremism or polarity in that way of going deeper into it. Because yeah, I think it is about this practice, like through design, for example, through what you're creating in terms of this practice of training thought in a different way, or that is a practice of learning how to hold the paradox, or learning that the space already contains both halves, but there's never really only one half. There's not one or not two. They're always co-creating each other. That is like, in a way, that's what I've been trying to do in my philosophy too. I'll send you this text. Like
I'd
I
love to
think about
watch
it
it.
a lot, and it's what I wrote my first thesis on with Hegel. And because I really feel like that practice, and it's why I think complex systems is so interesting, because we get past the linear and we learn how to hold what seem like opposites in the same space without them losing their potency.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. But that is a practice that is really important to learn, and also to learn that these opposing things are always changing and they're not static things. That's why I was pushing you about this objectivity, because something can be shared and objective in the sense that you mean it, without it being like it's not going to change, right? Maybe at the dinner table is the shared space. And if I and my parents or whoever are communicating, we're changing those halves, those Whitehead half truths on all sides, and the space itself is changing. And so this is not easy stuff, right, for just everyday people to kind of understand. But I think the more we talk about it and the more it becomes a natural understanding of this process, the more it infuses things like our design, or like the objects, or the, if you're doing this in design from this place, then what you're doing is, in a way, giving that pattern to people, in their daily lives, which is a pattern we need, but not to go into extremism in the one sense that could be very difficult, but rather to understand you hold the parts in the same way that, like, when you're sad, sometimes you just need to go deeper into that sadness, not push away from it and try to find a middle zone between happy and sad, because then you're going to just get right back into the sadness. So you got to sit with it, you got to look at it, what is it, and then you relax and surrender into it, and somehow it dissolves into its opposite, so to speak, right? And that process is wonderful, and I think that's what you're saying. Hold them, go deeper into them. But I push on it, because some people might hear it like, okay, if you hate this person X, then hate them more, and don't talk to them, and like stay away from them. And this is not the same thing.
No, well, I'm certainly not saying that, but I guess I'm willing to upset someone in order to have the conversation. So just as a good advert will jar you and make you think, what? And might irritate you. If it's doing that for a good reason, then arguably it's okay to do that, because the outcome is better than the initial feeling. And so that's very much the approach I'm taking. I'm certainly leveraging the negativity attached to these terms, and I'm trying to leverage it for a good reason, to say, no, actually, there is a good way of being polarized. There is a good way of being extreme. It's just not the way that we've come to think about it. So I'm being provocative on purpose.
Have you ever heard of this term edge work, where you sort of,
but I don't know.
It's used in a lot of different contexts, but where you're kind of doing what you're saying. You're moving into the extreme, getting right to the lip of, at the edge of what you've thought was the extreme. And somehow in doing that, if you're doing it in this conscious way of understanding that you're doing it, not just like going to get completely drunk, because then you don't have to think anymore, because that's a different kind of extreme, right? That's not a awareness kind of extreme. Then somehow you're going to open up. It's going to be disruptive in I think the way that you are pushing it.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
Positive disruption.
Yeah. And I did think of it when I was listening to because it's kind of at the end that you talk about that, and I was like, this is good. I think he's kind of trying to upset, because then you have to think about it more.
Yeah, I think that's the aim. And also, I guess it's only 5 minutes long, and so therefore I'm sure I've not framed things in the best way, and there's things missing and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. You have a good voice, by the way. Do you ever, I mean, you could almost work as like a voiceover for video.
I think I've got a good microphone.
Okay. Well, no, I think it's your voice too. It sounds like the kind of voice that, would be narrating documentaries or something. I don't know.
I mean, probably like everyone, I'm so used to hearing my voice recorded and then just squirming at the sound of it, just thinking how terrible it sounds. But I think that's a universal experience.
Yeah, I guess I want to hear what you want to do with this. Is it something you use in your everyday life as a designer now? Has it changed the way you do your work? I think you're writing a book or something, or writing something.
So I'm most of the way through a book. I've been trying to find an agent and found that difficult. I think it's not a great time to be writing a book with all the artificial intelligence.
Book writers. It's
So
always a good time to be writing a book if you have something that people want to need, or a message that's, I mean, it's just a transmission of perspective, and we always need that. So
I'm at the moment, I'm making a series of videos, sort of 5-minute videos that explore how you can apply that subject to tidying a room, or going on holiday, or building a relationship, that sort of thing. So kind of little, what again, masquerading as very shallow life hacks, but actually hopefully a little bit deeper. So just thinking how to apply that subject, the principle, to lots of different things. It is something I use all the time in design. I mean, it's something I just use all the time in life. I just everything it's almost unconscious now, that just approaching laying a table, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, okay, beauty. One definition of beauty is unity and diversity. So how do you make all the things on the table cohere as a whole, and yet all have their own individuality? And that's just in the back of my head, just going through. But all the time, it's just affecting my decisions. And it's just really fun to play with as well, just finding a new sort of pair of opposites in a given situation, thinking, oh, okay, I've not thought of that one before. How could I build that into my life? And I do really feel in a business context, it's something that's not really done. And I think there's a prevailing materialism across, well, life in general, so that we don't think that values are real, we don't think meaning is real. And so if you can get down to the core of a business or service or product, to the where meaning is the primary thing, and work outwards from there, I think that's a good thing to do. And so, yeah, it's turning up in my life in a lot of different ways.
do you just sort of walk down the street and do you see the world differently too? Do you, I mean, because these things really do become our cognitive patterns, like our.
Well, that's it. I can't remember what it's like not to do this.
No, okay.
I'm stuck.
I wonder what's going to be the opposite of that for you. That's gonna, you know, this is very meta, so it's gonna, you're gonna have
keep
to have
compounding on itself until I'm completely lost.
No, I mean, I think it's very creative opposition, and this pattern, this way of being in the world can be so, if people, the more ways we can help each other learn that, to hold the space and hold the opposites, the better, I think. Yeah, because
it's very exciting doing it.
It's exciting doing it. It opens you,
Yeah.
your sensuality, your perception, your capability for what you can handle in life. I mean, it really is a practice that extends to help you. I mean, I was talking about sadness and all this stuff, but it helps you creatively in your work, I think, as you're showing with the design, of course, in my work too, but just in everyday life, the way that you can deal with things when they come, the meaning, which is what really matters for all of us, right? Is this meaning. Even we get lost, but it matters for that, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. No, it turns everything on its head. So the meaning is the thing, and everything else comes out of that. And I think that's how we ought to approach everything. Is meaning first.
That's a good way to say it. It keeps you alert to that, to the meaning, not to the kind of. I'm thinking more about when we're talking about the client, where you're just trying to please each other, instead of kind of getting focused on something like that, which is so easy to do. This sort of practice does keep you aware of what actually matters, is meaningful in whatever process you're going through, not only design, but
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's cool that you're doing it. And thanks for reaching out. And
yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. It's been great fun.
Yeah, it has been. And let me know, what's going on. Stay in touch, and send me things other people can look at and find you through.
Yes, we'll do. And do send me the paper you've written.
Yeah, I will. Actually, it's a kind of a little Substack thing that I'm just starting. So I'm just maybe I'll just add your email to it. Is that okay?
Yeah, brilliant.
And then you get the first one, because it's actually about all the stuff we've been talking about in a way, from a different perspective. But I would really love to hear what you think about it from your perspective.
I'd love to see your take on things.
Cool. All right.
Thanks very much.
Stop. Thanks.